biggest pitfall is everyone says, forget that. And I'm like, you're throwing away 50 years of experience and you don't even understand what it's doing.
Welcome to Hired the Podcast, a conversation with the best and brightest minds in the world of work. I'm Travis Miller, and with me today I got Kevin Hanegan. Kevin's the former Chief Learning Officer at Qlik, a data and analytics company. He's also the chair of the advisory board for the Data Literacy Project and author of multiple books, including Turning Data into Wisdom, subtitled How We Can Collaborate with Data to Change Ourselves, Our Organization, and Even the World. So Kevin, the subtitle of your book gives me a little hint, but like I said, this is a conversation about the world of work. What am I doing talking to an expert about data analytics?
Yeah, it's funny how many times I'm on a podcast or a meeting and I say the word data or someone says it and instantly people are like, oh, time out, not me, wrong room. The world's changed, right? Everything is datafied. It's actually a verb now, datafication. So you don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to be a mathematician. You don't have to go to school for any of those things, but we're all exposed to data every day. You look at a review on Amazon before you buy something. You look at reviews on VRBO before you go on vacation. You look at your finances. So whether we like it or not, we're all exposed to data in its purest sense, and we just have to make sure we make the best representation and interpretation of it. It can be very misleading. It can show us things that are because we think it is objective, but our interpretation is subjective, and it gets us in trouble.
So how have you seen companies, and we'll start on that side of the conversation. How have you seen companies utilizing analytics in the world of work? So whether that's attracting talent, hiring talent, onboarding talent, retaining talent.
Yeah, great question. I mean, it starts with, obviously, before you get the data, what's the goal? What's the question?
Sure.
What are you trying to do? Like you said, what are the right people you're trying to onboard? You can do the best analysis, but if you don't have the right skills map, then it's off, right? You can build the best product, but if you don't understand your customer and their base, it's off. So I think, taking that to the next level, data gives us more evidence or information to help us hit our goals. So with work, right? If we're hiring, well, we probably have job descriptions. So our job descriptions, we can datafy them. We can turn them into skills maps and competencies. And these are the things we're looking for. And that can help us weed out filters and resumes that are coming in. We can help us do more statistical analysis on what is the right combination of people. Because again, one of the benefits we've learned over time is we don't want cookie cutters in an organization, because then you only have one cookie, one business model, right? You want to get diversity. And I think with all that complexity, it's hard to do that in our brain. We need data. We need analytics to help us do that. So it could be that, I use Myers-Briggs type indicators. I'm a INTJ. Could be that, I'm a thinker and I've hired a bunch of thinkers. Maybe I need to find a feeler now. And so all of that stuff at the end of the day, whether you call it evidence, whether you call it information, whether you call it data, it's driving it. And so that's kind of the onboarding, but then you're building a service, you're building a product. You have to have a customer, understanding the customer. How do they use your product? What are they looking for? That's all evidence, information, data. And so you imagine this booklet that's like 1 million pages wide about your customers and the market and everything. Now someone says, okay, go make sense of that and tell me how it's going to help me hit my goal. Can't do that. Brain can't do that. But analytics and data helps you do that. So it makes us do things better, and it makes us do better things.
Yeah, hiring's tricky because it's a lot of times I see companies on either one end of the extreme. So you got company A, unless a resume is a 90% match to the job description, they won't talk to the person. Unless somebody passes this technical assessment, they won't talk to the person. Unless somebody passes a personality and performance assessment, they won't talk to the person. Then they've got to pass the Wonderlic exam. If they don't have this level of intelligence, they won't talk to the person. Or you go to the other extreme, and the company will talk to anyone, and there's no strategy to the interviewing process. And they're just kind of like, well, I like this person. They fit with their vibe, so let's take a chance on them. And it's probably the time of year, but I got baseball on the brain, and I think of Moneyball a lot. And for decades and decades, it was the old farts sitting there spitting sunflower seeds and tobacco juice into paper cups who lived the baseball life for 60 years, and they know what they were looking for, and they didn't know anything. And then you had Bill James and the Oakland A's come to town and the sabermetrics revolution, and then some organizations were so focused solely on analytics that they lost the heart of what makes a team. And I've been thinking about this for years. What's the middle ground for recruiting, for hiring, of utilizing analytics, but still being able to focus on the heart of what makes a team, what makes a company and organization great? Can you think of any examples of companies or organizations that you've worked with or you've seen that have kind of started to figure that middle ground out?
Absolutely. I'll take a step back. I'll answer it first. I think the companies that are doing well today are the ones that figured it out, because there's challenges with both of those equations you gave, right? If you just blindly hire the same people, or if you kind of over-engineer and just say, I have no plan, but I want to, like, the companies that do it well, the reason they do it is because what you said is spot on. It's a blend of an art and a science. It's a blend of data and human skills. So there are things that computers and analytics can do better than humans. It can crunch massive databases. So Moneyball, right? You have all the at-bats of all the players ever. That's this huge 100-page Bible that someone's not going to be able to process. The analytics tools can do that. But that's not giving you the context. It's not giving you the assumptions. It's not giving you the human look and feel that you need someone like a Bill James or an HR recruiter to look at and do kind of like the final validation. So in an ideal world, you have to do both. And to your first point, a lot of the tech companies now, even though they're high innovative, high tech, they're also finding out that there's the balance of the human skills. So you look at like Google as an example, they might be one of the most technically savvy companies, but they still have the human element of their recruiting and of their design process. And so I just think people don't realize, I think people think it's an either or, and in reality, it's both. And it's in life too. If I don't want to just overanalyze, I still need to use my brain and my cognitive abilities, but I don't want to use those entire my brain to do number crunching. Like, let's let the analytics do that.
So if you were running a human resources, talent acquisition, or recruit department or recruiting company, what are the things that you would be keeping track of? What data would you want to look at? Or maybe even back to the beginning of our conversation, what are the goals we should be setting so we can try and identify what data to look at?
Exactly. I'll answer both, but I think one of the challenges I've seen is there, a typical organization that's not too big, medium, small and medium size, they may have budget for 10 new hires in a year, and maybe they're split out over 3 or 4 departments. So when you look at data and insights, one of the questions you look at is like the timeliness, the relevance, the reversibility of it. Those people are saying, I have to hit my target. I can't mess this hire up. So instead of getting more specific, they get more general and say, okay, well, I'm going to open my doors because it's better to hire someone now than just keep looking at them and not hiring someone. On the flip side, the cost of hiring the wrong person is massive. So things that I would look at would be, let's look at everyone we've hired already, and let's, do some type of performance talent evaluation on them, which I'm assuming we do anyways, and see if there's a pattern. Was there a certain trait, or maybe not the Wonderlic test, but was there a competency map that most of those hit, or the ones that didn't hit, what did they have in common? Was it their experience? Was it their education? Was it their real life experience? Whatever it was. And then I would feed that back into the hiring and say, okay, let's look for these things. Because, you mentioned baseball. Think of like the draft. You have teams that go for the best player on the board, and you have teams that go for, okay, I need this position. So they might not be the best player, so I'm going to either draft down or I'm just going to hire them. Because most organizations don't have lots of recs that they can play around with, they're tunnel focus on, I need to fill this need. Places that I see doing it really well is you hire before the need, knowing that there's going to be attrition. Now, small companies don't have the luxury to do that, right? Because there's more money. But if you can hire before the need, you can pick the best people that you need out there, even if it's not just pigeonholed into that job. So I feel bad saying the answer is doing that, but then realizing a lot of companies financially can't do that. But think about hiring as a continuous process, not I have 5 recs, let me open them up now, and this is the 5 people I need. Just know you have turnover and open them up early.
It's the old Wayne Gretzky quote. And
exactly.
We might have already reached our quota for sports metaphors in first 10 minutes of this conversation, but it's skate to where the puck is going to be.
Yes.
We actually find ourselves in a really similar predicament right now, Kevin. We smallish, mid-sized company, mid-sized for a recruiting firm, plan to hire 8 to 12 people this year. Already hired 1, and we have 6 candidates who are all at or close to final step in the process, and they're all pretty darn stellar. And we don't really know what we're going to do. Can we hire all 5 or 6 of them at the same time? Can we handle the training? Can we handle the budget of it? And in our business, it takes people a while to ramp up. So it's an investment for people's first 6 to 12 months before they kind of catch up. And we're really trying to figure out what to do. What would you suggest that an organization in our shoes would do? What should we be looking at?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll answer it 2 ways. Taking a step back to the beginning of the fiscal year planning, it doesn't happen where they always say yes, like the CFO. But what I try to do is I try to build that variability into the beginning of the year. So knowing that I have to overhire. And they're always like, well, Kevin, you have 3. Why do you need 5? Well, because 1 or 2 are going to leave. And that gives me the flexibility if I find 5 stars to do it. And your point of hiring them at the same time and do we have the scale and capacity to onboard and train at the same time is valid. But usually what I'd like to say is if you find all of those, chances are your attrition is not 0. And use that data to your advantage. So if you say, okay, the past rolling 24 months, we have lost 2 or 3 heads on average, then what you're really asking for is you're just asking to hire someone 2 or 3 months earlier than normal. What finance knows, and they play in their favor, is if you have a hire that's supposed to start April 1st, they're not starting April 1st usually. You might find them then, but then there's a couple months that they get that extra savings. So ask if that savings available to hire 2 months before you need to.
Yeah, from a budget perspective, if I think about it from that point of view, is I'm just hiring them 2 months early. That also means they're more likely to be successful 2 months earlier and start being productive sooner. Yeah, I can see that. And I think the question that companies should ask themselves if they're in this situation is, if we only hire 2 of them now, would we be disappointed if in 2 months the other people had taken other opportunities and weren't available? And would we be able to find people who are at least just as good as them, relatively speaking? And if the answer is, yeah, I'd be disappointed, and I'm not positive I could find people who are as good as them, then I think you probably got your answer. You've got to figure out a way to make it work.
Yeah, and I'd add in a third question there, which is where the data can help, is if I only hire those 2 people, what's the risk if 1 or both of them leave within the first 90 days? What are you losing against your goals that year? Because that's where you get, the finance team is, okay, well, I need this, but what's it going to cost? Well, what's it going to cost if I hire 2 and I lose 1 or 2? It's going to cost a lot more than hiring someone a couple of months early.
Yeah. So with the hiring process being as complex and subjective as it is, what are some of the biggest pitfalls that you see bringing this philosophy into your hiring process being able to mitigate?
Yes, I think the biggest pitfall, and we kind of touched upon it, the biggest pitfall is picking a side instead of the middle. So the example that I see all the time in recruiting, but in just business, where people say, okay, intuition, done, don't use it, time out, leave it, go forward, we're data driven. And I'm like, you don't really understand what intuition is. And they're like, well, no, everyone says don't use your gut. And then me with the data hat, I'm like, okay, so explain to me what you think intuition is. And sometimes they're like, oh, well, someone closes their eyes and magically an answer comes out and it might be right. I'm like, well, where do you think the answer came from? And they're like, I don't know. I said, it comes from your long-term memory. So if you have 50 years recruiting, intuition is your 50 years of experience coming out unconsciously. Who wouldn't want to use that? The problem is if 49 of those were based off of something before the business model changed, your brain doesn't know the business model changed, so it's going to give you the old answer. So you need to check the intuition. So biggest pitfall is everyone says, forget that. And I'm like, you're throwing away 50 years of experience and you don't even understand what it's doing. So start with your intuition and then just validate it with the human side. That's the biggest pitfall. I think the other one is there's no such thing as a perfect answer in life, any answer. And the analysis paralysis I see, I mean, I've seen organizations invest millions in data lakes and predictive modeling, not just for recruiting, but it includes recruiting, to come up with an answer that isn't even materially different than what you would have answered without it, because they don't understand the model, they don't understand the business. So I think summarizing that one, the biggest pitfall is don't overinvest in the tech. Start small, build a pilot, build up what you need to do. Eventually you might get to the Bill James level of the Moneyball, but you don't need all of that technology in the beginning. Trust, the business, if that kind of makes sense.
So you're saying that an HR department shouldn't hire a Yale economist in order to build up their new hiring analytics?
Well, I guess over time, yes, once you've figured out your model, but not from day one, no.
I wanted to ask you about, so how could you figure out your model? You talk in a lot in your writing about your six-step process and how to start with data analytics. Can you dig into that a little bit for me?
Yeah, I mean, it starts kind of intuitively backwards. It's like the chicken and the egg. Everyone says, Kevin, what comes first, the data or the question? The question. If you don't have the question, what good is it? But most organizations build the data lake, the data warehouse, and then they come back and say, all right, it's live. What do you want to do? And it doesn't line. So the 6 steps is very front loaded, where the first one is, what is the question, the problem you're trying to solve? And what's challenging is 3 things. The first thing is everyone tends to classify that problem, if they've taken an MBA, into strategic, tactical, or operations. Not enough in today's world. Like, you need different things. Is it reversible? Is it what's the risk of hiring the wrong person? What's the risk of, the risk of me flying someone to the moon is different than the risk of me choosing what the wrong sandwich is at the cafeteria. So you kind of have to figure out, what am I defining? And then when you're to the next step, most of us don't understand the difference between a business question and a data question. So a business question would be, okay, which candidate should I hire for this job?
Okay.
Very subjective. My litmus test is if I can hand a statement to someone not in the business, like to the data team, in 2 or 3 different people, and they give me the same answer, then it's a data question. So just like we have SMART objectives, a data question needs to be more specific. So any terminal, what's the hiring criteria? What's the factors? What's the dimensions? Using a non-recruiting example, someone says, how was my marketing campaign? You can get 50 different answers. Like, what do you define as success? What are the different components you're looking at? Do you want to see by channel, by geography, by demographic? What is the criteria that's acceptable? Doing all that stuff before, because going back to recruiting, are you recruiting, it ties to your core values. Are you recruiting just the what, or are you recruiting the how too? Some organizations just focus on the what. They're a star contributor. I don't care how they do it. They might not have any core values. They might not fit culturally, but I'm focused on quantifiable metrics. Other organizations are like, well, no, it matters how, because we have a strong culture. So all those qualitative components are there. And again, my answer is you got to be both. You need the what and the how. You need to set that up in the beginning to give people the right. So I need someone who acts this way. I need someone that's going to do these outputs, but going back to the pitfalls, what are the right outputs? Is it just hitting your revenue target? Because going sideways, I have a problem with a lot of organizations because their KPIs are lagging performance targets, and they don't have any leading indicators that are kind of like early warning signs that someone's off. And you can hit your revenue target and fail at everything else and be a horrible person. Doesn't mean you're a good hire. So step one is build that framework out.
Well, the quantitative ones are the easiest to measure, but so often the qualitative are the most important. I mean, if you're watching this podcast, or listening to it, you're probably on LinkedIn, and you can't scroll 10 seconds on LinkedIn without somebody saying, fire your toxic high performers.
Yep.
But that's all quantitative. How can companies utilize this philosophy on the qualitative side of the business?
I mean, there are some that will do personality tests. The companies I work for don't like doing that, just, I think, not for security reasons, but they just don't feel comfortable doing that beforehand. But like, you're getting into a relationship. Wouldn't you want to know more about the why people do that? So I think it's interviewing skills. Like, I intentionally, when I interview, going into interviewing someone, I have my list of like technical questions, business questions, but I always have to have 2 or 3 open-ended, like how you do it type questions that map to our core values. So if one of our core values is teamwork for results, I'll ask a question about collaboration. If one of our core values around, challenge, then I'll ask if situations about how they challenge and things. Someone could lie in the interview, but I mean, the more practice you get with interviewing, the more you can tell those things out based off of how they answer their question, how short it is, how long it is, how, good the stories are. If it's just like a story that you think ChatGPT made up or something, you don't kind of buy it. So there's an art form of it, I guess, but it's all about interviewing and asking. You don't have the luxury to do a 360 review, but asking people that you might know in common with each other. I'm not a big fan. I ask for references, but I very rarely had a negative reference because I think people don't like giving. So I don't weigh those too much as what I see on social media or LinkedIn or maybe peers that they know.
Those qualitative questions that you're asking, are you also finding out a way to quantify those answers, keeping track of it, measuring the answers against future success?
There's a few techniques. One of them is called coding, and there's different ways you can do it, but you can come into it with a map of a code that are just different categories. So at the lowest level, if we're looking at someone teamwork for results, I could pre-classify, okay, based off of this, I'm going to put them in one of 4 buckets. I'm going to put them in extremely team player. So I would come up with better categories, and I'd have a better rubric that says what goes inside of there. But then after the interview, I put them in that bucket. So then I can quantify, and I can say this person's a 4 on teamwork, but there are 2 on communication, or there are 1 on empathy, but there are 4 on, take responsibility. It's not an ideal science, but you can do that kind of coding that way, as opposed to if you have a team of 5 people interviewing, they don't have a common denominator to score it, then, like you said, it becomes subjective, and then it's hard to quantify it that way. So to your point, turning qualitative into quantitative is essential for that.
You mentioned that a lot of people you work with don't use the personality assessments, but I couldn't tell. Is that something that you are pro and an advocate of, or you don't think they're a good idea?
It's a loaded question. I'm pro if it's used right. I'm not pro if it's not used right. And I guess it also has to be the right assessment. I mean, there are so many issues with the amount of questions I've seen in trainings and interviews where the person that did it had no training in cultural sensitivity, or no training in how to write not misleading questions where it's like a triple negative. Those exams that we're talking about are built by like cybermetricians that are, they have PhDs and all these other things to make sure they're legally binding, kind of. They're expensive. So a lot of companies don't do it. So end of the day, if they use one of those big ones, the psychometrician ones, yeah, it's great. The rate of false negatives or positives are very low. But if someone says, I'm just going to create my own, so we don't have to have the budget, I don't trust it and I would never use it. And a
No,
lot of people create their own. That's the problem.
no, that's one of those things. I don't trust myself to do electrical work in my house, and I wouldn't trust me to write a personality assessment and have it mean anything. I want to flip the conversation a little bit to the other side of the business. If people are searching for work or assessing their career, what are some ways that they might be able to reframe their brain to be a little bit more analytical in their approach?
Yep. And I think that's a good point, is that in general, data, you can not be a data guy or lady, like statistician, whatever, but you can still think more analytically. You can still think more logically. My recommendation to everyone is learn about how the brain works. And I'm not saying so much like neuroscience or so forth, but what I find is when people understand how the brain processes information in the pitfalls there, they're instantly thinking more analytically. So I could go to college, I could go to university, I could take a course in analytical thinking, and it's teaching me math. It's teaching me logical reasoning. Like if A equals B and B equals C, does A equal C? Useful, but not really useful. What I want to learn is that the brain has a bias. The brain filters out information it doesn't think is relevant. So you need to make sure it knows what's relevant. The brain has to take shortcuts, so it's going to find patterns that may not exist. And the number one skill to overcome this is questioning, open-ended questioning. So anyone that wants to be more analytical, I'd say learn the Socratic method. It's a way of just asking open-ended questions. Learn that the brain is biased and the way it makes these decisions, it doesn't mean someone's negative or evil. It just means that's how the brain works. Until they realize that, it almost doesn't even matter, because they don't realize that sometimes it's playing tricks on them. When I do a lecture, the first 5 minutes, I'll do 5 questions that I'll say, I'm going to prove that you have biases. And they're like, no, we don't have bias. And then they go through and they answer the questions. And at the end, I'm like, well, why'd you choose that? And they're like, I don't know. My brain told me to. I'm like, I know, that's the point. You had an opinion. So one of them's on confirmation bias. You had an opinion about this person. I asked a leading question about this person that validated your opinion. You agreed with it. You didn't disagree with it. They're like, oh, okay. So analytic thinking is politely disagree with it. Be skeptical. Challenge it. It's not anything to do with like A equals B, B equals C. And I think that's a big misunderstanding, is we data guys get a bad rap. We're actually probably more art than we are science. I talk more about psychology than I do about, calculus.
Go into that more. What do you mean more art than science? You're crunching numbers.
We're crunching numbers, but so that number comes back and that number says 52. What does that mean? Well, it depends what the question is. It depends what it means to me. Does that number, I'll give you one more sports analogy. So I say the number 12. I'm from New England. I think Tom Brady. I don't even know if I'm a football fan. I just say Tom Brady. You say someone else or something else. So the number is the number. The crunching is step one. Step two, which is 90% of the value, is what does it mean to me in the question I'm asking? And a number is not going to tell you that. That's the human brain telling you what it means to me. So yes, you need to learn how to crunch numbers, but no, because someone else can crunch the numbers for you. What you need to know is, how do I interpret that number? So I'll give you an example. Like there might be a study that comes out on the news and it says a pharmaceutical company is testing a new blood pressure drug. And they come back and they did a control group and they find that the test was statistically significant. And we don't have to get into the numbers of like the stats they use. They use something called a p-value, highly relevant. Everyone gets excited because they see the number and they see a statistician said it's statistically significant. Someone using the brain and the art is going to question, okay, it's statistically significant. What does that mean? Like, okay, so we're talking about blood pressure. How much does it actually change the blood pressure? If it changes it from, I don't know what units they use, but 1 unit. So if mine's like 180 over 40 and it goes down to 179 over 40, is that a big deal? No, it's not. But it's statistically significant. It's just not a big deal. So we need people that question those things. We need people that apply those. And as much as you can make a science out of questioning, a lot of it is going back to our kids. Like they just say, why? If you call that a science, I guess. I like to say it's an art, because like questions lead to more questions and it doesn't fit into like a decision tree or like a flow chart.
So what are some of the questions that you, well, maybe not the questions, but the questioning philosophy that somebody searching for a new position should apply when they're assessing other companies or talking to people that they will end up working with, could end up working with?
So if there's someone looking for a job and they're assessing companies they might want to work with, it's questions there. I mean, the obvious ones like what's the culture? What's the problem is when you see a job description, imagine that's the data, right? So to your point, what are the questions I want to ask about the data? That's where it becomes an art. But I would, it's a good question. Taking a step back, I think what I would do is if there was a job description that says this person needs to do A, this person needs to do B, this person needs to do C, I might use open-ended questioning to say, okay, I understand what you're saying about the job descriptions, but can you give me a day in the life of this person? And then the person interviewing you kind of has to do what is in that paper, but they give you more context around it. Like maybe from a data point of view, they give you percents of time a day or so forth. If there's let's say I do everything right under the skills required, but there's one thing that I'm not too familiar with. Maybe it's like build web pages, and I don't build web pages. I might ask a question like, "Can you give me some more context? What is the meaning behind the build web page? Like, what are you asking me to do?" And if it turns out that it's less about building the web page and more about writing the content for the web page, then perfect, because that's up my alley. But we're making assumptions every time we read the job descriptions because by nature, they can't be too long because we lose people's attention. So finding those words that could be confusing, subjective, and asking open-ended questions about those things, because their interpretation of building websites might be, I'm just writing words, whereas to me it means, well, they want me to program that. I'm not a programmer.
I think that's good for the quantitative side of the job. What am I going to be doing? But we're talking about culture earlier, and that's the most qualitative thing out there. And when you're in the interview process, no company has ever said, oh, our culture sucks. It's terrible. Everybody thinks they have a great culture. Everybody says they have a great culture. How can somebody analyze that? What data should they be looking for in order to analyze it? That's a great
question. I see where you're going. So questions I would ask is, how do you if there's a disagreement between two colleagues, how do you decide on that? I would ask, when you're in a meeting about strategic planning, how is the meeting facilitated? And taking a step back on that one, like there's a concept of a discussion where we're all in a meeting together, and the output of a discussion is a winner and a loser. We don't realize this, but we're not actively listening. I'm not listening to you. I'm deciding what I'm going to say that proves you wrong. In a dialogue where you have a strong culture of data and less hierarchy, everyone suppresses the outcome of winning, losing, and it's about understanding. I want to sit back and listen to what Travis said. I'll decide later. So I'd ask, what's your decision-making structure? Who do you invite to those meetings? Are they at different levels? If you have disagreements, how do you settle them? Do you offer professional development courses on things like active listening, DE&I, bias? So I think those could come, because if there's a culture that's very hierarchical, like a typical company in the 50s, they're not going to have any of that stuff. It's going to be command and control. And whether they say it or not, the answer is like, well, the manager makes the decision. I might even say, okay, if you have someone who has a different point of view, what's the best way for them to make that known? And if the person says anything remotely like, well, that's not acceptable in a nice way, then it's not a great culture in today's world.
This has to have dramatically shifted. Well, of course, you've grown up in this. This is how you've lived your life for 20 years now. How do you view the world differently than a normal person whose world isn't data analytics? What's the world like through your eyes that it might be different from someone who doesn't think about this stuff on a regular basis?
Yeah, another good question. I think my lens, even though I'm going to say data first, but with my lens is I politely am skeptical about everything. I'm not a pessimist. I'm very much an optimist, but I like to politely challenge what looks like it's obvious. I don't invest a lot of time in it, but for most people, they see something. And I'll give you a personal story because I think those resonate with the readers. So real quick, I have 4 kids, love them all to death. My oldest one has some mental health challenges, autism, borderline. And he was in school when he was in 2nd grade, and we got a call he was going to get kicked out. We go to the team meeting, and they're like, what's going on? They're like, well, he's behaving bad. He's kicking. He's destroying property. So, okay, well, what data lens? Okay, are we isolated incident? They're like, no, there's been 15 occurrences in the past 2 weeks. So the data lens, I'm like, okay, well, what's causing that? What's the root cause? Can you take more data? Can you tell me the day, the time of the day? Because if it's a Monday, it's because he was home for the weekend. If it's like a right after lunch, it's an unstructured time. Can you also calculate what happened before? Because if it was a transition and what was the consequence? Long story short, they capture all the data. They come back 2 weeks later. We have a team meeting. And they're like, behaviors are continuing. There's no pattern there. We're going to kick them out. And I look at the data because I'm thinking analytically with this data background. I see a connection. So in the data, the consequence 90% of the time was they send them to the principal.
Mm-hmm.
So, right, teachers like go to the principal. I'm like, my son likes going to the principal. He likes adults better than kids. They're like, no, not true. Never happened. Never seen a kid like going to the principal. I'm like, really? So we call him in, and I'm like, how was your day? He's like, Dad, it was great. I punched Mrs. Smith. They sent me to the principal. She read to me for an hour. I'm going to punch her twice tomorrow. Can I get 2 hours? All their jaws drop. But to answer your question, they weren't seeing it from my lens of what else could have been causing this. They saw it at surface value. Kids hitting people. He has behaviors. We can't control him. Let's get him out. They didn't look beyond and say, well, why? Well, why? Oh, because he was doing it on purpose. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't connect in our brains. So our brains just filter it out. So I think it's a long way of saying I'm looking second level of what's happening. And anyone, not just me, anyone that thinks analytically wants to figure that out. We want to figure out root causes. Doctors do it great. Scientists do it great.
Did you figure out a solution in that situation?
Well, they stopped sending them to the principal, and behaviors dropped almost instantly. There was a little bit of an extinction burst where he's like, well, no, I'm going to keep doing it until they do it. So it took a couple of days, but after that, way down. And end of story, he stayed in school, didn't get expelled.
I had a similar situation earlier this year where my young son was every day violent outbursts at school, unable to stay in his seat, throwing stuff on the floor. And it was unfortunate. His teacher was on extended leave, and there was a semi-permanent substitute there. And God bless all of these substitutes out there. But she came in right as it was starting, and so she only saw this behavior from him. And we had to go in, we had to have a sit down. He was on a program to modify these behaviors. And it was bad, and it ended up getting better a couple weeks later. And then a few weeks later, his teacher came back, and it was time for conferences, and she says, yeah, I heard about all of that. That must have been challenging. That was so weird. That was so out of character for him. What was going on? I'm like, I don't know. It was like, I mean, you had left the week before, so it was a change of routine, and then he got sick, and he was home for a couple of days, and he's on some medication, and then he came back, and it was like just like that. And she said, medication? What kind of medication? And he said, well, he's they put him on some steroids. She said, oh, okay. For how long? Like a week? She's like, he was on steroids for a week? What is wrong with that doctor? That's crazy. That's absolutely what it was. Your kid was just, he had roid rage. He had roid rage. And the substitute hadn't experienced enough children on a constant basis. She didn't have all of the data to analyze. And made that rash judgment based on her small data set and wasn't able to look outside of her world.
That's a perfect example. Yeah. And in hindsight, it could have been something like maybe she changed the bath time routine, that like going to the bath later. I've seen that happen where people get frustrated because it lets them get out of their seat and move around. But if they all of a sudden change it to the afternoon, kids go crazy because they have ADHD, not yours. I'm just saying in general, like small things like that people don't think about. So thinking analytically is asking those questions. What's different? And not just accepting the face value that your kid's a troublemaker, my kid's a troublemaker.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, this has been great. Who are the people that should be reaching out to you, and what should they be reaching out to you to get help with?
I think it's anyone who, when they hear the word data, they squirm, and yet they want to do things better, and they want to do better things. They want to use it to help them in their personal life, use it to help them in business, organize their strategy, execute on their strategy. And it's just, talking about recruiting, there are these overall life skills. We talk about like the what and the how, but there's also these like life skills that I think are valuable for everything. I think data literacy is one of those, as well as like active listening and other things. But anyone should want to do this because I think it's going to help them make better decisions, and more importantly, minimize not so great decisions.
What's the best way for someone to find you?
You can just go on LinkedIn. I think there's only two of us, Kevin Hanegan, me, and someone else who's like a maritime engineer, not me. And then go to my website, turningdataintowisdom.com.
All right. Kevin Hanegan, this has been fantastic. Really appreciate it. This has been Hire the Podcast. Thank you to Noah Cuff, our producer. Track down any episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much.